Hey folks, so today we're going to be talking about, well, first off, I hope y'all are doing well. We're going to get into chapter 6 today, and that's going to be about supply demand government policies. So if you remember what we've talked about so far is we talked in the first three chapters about how do we kind of understand economics as a whole, what kind of principles are at play. We proved why trade's valuable, and then in chapter 4 we introduced the concept of markets. And that, of course, that's incredibly important. And that's going to be a key factor in how we analyze everything from here. And then in chapter 5, we talked about elasticity and we explored how does elasticity affect and impact who does what, how much these variables are changing in between. That's another important concept because really elasticity and markets really come into question when we talk about chapter 6. And so how do government policy and markets interact? So first off, we have price controls, and let me get my pointer up here. So in this chapter, we're really talking about price controls, which are government policies that basically are legal controls placed on markets that prevent markets from fluctuating below or above certain prices. So the concept really going on with price controls is that the government doesn't want the market to be in equilibrium intentionally, or they don't like the equilibrium outcome. And you might be like, well, why is that? And we'll talk about later why that might be the case. But for now, there's two kinds of price floors and price ceilings that the government has available to them. The first is that, or there's two kinds of price controls. The first is a price ceiling, which is a legal maximum on the price at which a good can be sold. In order for a price ceiling to be effective, it must be below the equilibrium price. Now, pause right here. You might be like, wait, so why is it called a ceiling if it's below the equilibrium? And the reason is because a ceiling basically says you can't go higher than the ceiling, right? Like if you're in a room, you can't go above the ceiling. And so the market, we presume, always is going to go to equilibrium. That's how we function. That's what we suggest is that like if the price is too expensive and there's too much made, well, guess what? If there's this huge surplus of stuff made, what's going to happen? We're going to cut back on prices and drop down. However, if prices are too low and not enough, and people are buying too much of it, and there's not enough out there, then prices are going to rise in the face of that. So in this example, we're talking about a situation which equilibrium, yeah, the amount sold is the amount bought, but we're saying that we don't like that price, and so we put a ceiling to control and bring the price below equilibrium. And so this creates an artificial shortage. And by saying it creates artificial shortage, what we mean is by the price ceiling being below the equilibrium quantity, what that tells us is that the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. And we'll see an example of this in a second, but this makes sense, right? That if equilibrium is where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied, then if we're at a price below that, well, according to our law of supply, that means quantity supplied declines because the price is down. And meanwhile, according to our law of demand, that says the quantity demanded increases because the price is low. And so now we have this artificial gap, which is a shortage. In contrast, a price floor is a legal minimum on the price at which a good can be sold. And in order for it to be effective, it must be above the equilibrium price. So basically, a price floor is a legal minimum on the price at which a good can be sold. In order for it to be effective, we have to be above the equilibrium price. And again, way to think about this, you can't go lower than the floor. If the floor is below the equilibrium, then the market just goes to equilibrium. It just kind of says, hey, that's real cute that you tried to put this price control in here, but we're going to this price. And so that's how a price floor kind of works, is it has to prevent the market from going to equilibrium. And in this case, the price floor works by putting a price that prevents the market from pushing down further. So what does this look like? Well, let's just consider an example of a market with a price ceiling. And so this is an example in which the government imposes a price ceiling of $4 about where the equilibrium price was $3. So this is our equilibrium price, $3. This is our equilibrium, and our quantity is 100. Notice our demand curve, right, is just following the law of demand. So it's downward sloping. Our supply curve is following the law of supply, so it's upward sloping. So the price ceiling tells us that, hey, like you can't price above this price. Well, if we look at this example, right, the equilibrium is below that price. So the market, again, is just kind of like, hey, that's a really cute suggestion. We're going to wait, let that opportunity pass us, and we're going at equilibrium. We'll stay at our $3 and 100. Because even if we were to price at $4, we'd have a surplus. And that means we're going to just drop prices back and go to equilibrium. So a price ceiling, if it's placed above the equilibrium, has no effect. The market just goes to equilibrium. However, example B gives us the idea of a price ceiling that is binding. And notice that with this price ceiling, $2, we're now below the equilibrium price of $3. So the government has said you can't charge more than $2, but the market wants to be at $3. The consequence is that consumers are like, oh, yes, absolutely. I will definitely buy this at $2. And producers are like, oh, no, I'm not making this much for that many people at $2. And so we wind up with a quantity supplied of 75 and a quantity demanded of 125. Since quantity demanded here is greater than quantity supplied, so let me see if I can draw a little drawing here that doesn't look absolutely hideous. Since quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied, this is what we call the shortage. And you can see right here that we have this mark, the shortage. Now, real quick, if I asked you to calculate the shortage, real easy calculation. Quantity demanded is 125. Quantity supplied is 75. All you do is subtract the quantity demanded or quantity supplied from quantity demanded. So 125 minus 75, that equals 50. Our shortage equals 50 units. So pretty simple math, not too hard. Just find the difference between quantity demand and quantity supplied. That tells you the size of the shortage. Now, why are we interested in price ceiling? Well, for example, this isn't so much an issue today, right? Because we kind of have delightful gas prices. But this was a big deal for the 1970s. And in the 1970s, the government tried to institute a price ceiling that prevented gas from going above a certain price because prices were really high. So let's just look at this example. This is a price ceiling of gasoline that's not binding. So initially the price ceiling is not binding. It's put up here, and you know what? We have this. Excuse me. Today. So we have this price ceiling. And see, even though the price ceiling is non-binding, it's actually going to kind of have an impact. Why is that? When supply falls, what ends up happening is with the price ceiling in place, it becomes binding. And so if the supply decreases leftward in this example, so to be clear, this is our first move. So we're at our, notice I will, let me circle this. So where I'm circling in blue, this is our original equilibrium. Okay. Note that, draw that, make a copy, and pause the video if you'd like, because next what we're going to do is we're going to look at our new equilibrium. And our new equilibrium is we have a supply shift leftward. Oop, I don't like that curve. We have supply shift leftward as, I'll just switch to the finger because he's done a better job. So our supply is shifting leftward. That means it's decreasing from what we talked about in chapter 4. Supply decreases. We're now at this S2, we're still at the original demand curve. And so this, what I'm going to circle here, this is our new equilibrium after this decrease in supply. What this means is that our price ceiling is actually now binding. So this is our point 3. The price ceiling becomes binding because with a contraction in supply, the ceiling is now binding. What this does is this results. And so what we're trying to get here is that even if a price ceiling is non-binding, it can actually create kind of disastrous effects because it actually sets the expectation that, oh, we could earn this. And if we decrease the supply, we could earn this amount of money. And so we're actually going to look at another example. Well, to rephrase, in this example of gasoline, this is what happened in the 1970s, is we had a huge contraction of gas. Then we had a huge, we instituted a price ceiling, and then we created and exacerbated a shortage that was non-existent beforehand. But that's not really what I want to walk away from. A more interesting case for this is the study of rent control. And so in this example, the supply for rent control when rent is controlled is basically constant or perfectly inelastic. There's no incentive to build new homes at this rent. However, All right, let me rephrase and clarify this. Our supply is vertical when you have controlled rent because at this price, there's no incentive for any further development of housing. You can't make any more money off housing. You would have to be able to create more at a lower cost, but we've already maxed out the amount of property we can build at this cost. Demand, of course, is thrilled though, right? Because they're like, yeah, I'll pay that cheaper price than the equilibrium price. The problem is demand exceeds our quantity demanded right here exceeds our quantity supplied right here to the left of it. And for this area here, this will be our shortage. And where this becomes a really significant problem is just in the short run. This is just showing us that we're not willing to build that much in the short run. But in the long run, our supply is more elastic than it is in the short run. So in the short run, we basically were saying that like, oh yeah, you can't just magically build new apartments overnight. But in the long run, you should be able to build more. However, with the controlled rent, there's no incentive for us to move from the quantity supplied we're already right. So our small shortage becomes a much larger shortage under controlled rent. The reason that New York City has such sky high rent is a long term consequence of price ceilings, particularly rent control. So if you ever watch Friends, one of the big gags is the reason they can afford it is that they have price control. But if you look at that apartment without price controls, it's ridiculously expensive. Now, price floors, we're going to get into two examples here. Price floors, again, these are, whoop, we're going to look at the case of minimum wage. Price floors, again, this is our below the price floors say that the price cannot go below this point. So in order for it to be binding, it has to be above the equilibrium price. And so the classic example of this is minimum wage. And so what we're interested in, how does minimum wage affect the labor market? So presumably the labor market is, and you can see here, the labor supply is pretty straightforward upwards. Like as the price for a job goes up, more people are willing to do that job. Labor demand is downward the more expensive labor gets for that job. So pretty typical standard supply and demand graph. What we find here, though, is that if you institute a binding minimum wage, there has to be the creation of some labor surplus, i.e., unemployment. And so, unemployment, at least some kind of structural unemployment, is considered a temporary consequence of a market in which you've instituted a price floor. So, why does it work this way for minimum wage, you might be asking? Reasons. Presumably, if the market's in equilibrium, they're willing to pay. Presumably, if the market's in equilibrium, that means as many people are working as companies are willing to buy. However, if minimum wage is successful and pushes firms upward, what it means is they now have less money to spend over the same amount of employees. Because the price has gone up. And so typically what this means is that firms start figuring out ways to reduce their labor supply. So to give you a classic example, one of the real debates is whether or not currently the fact that when you go into Walmart or Kroger or the fact you can order for your phone, whether or not this is actually a substitute for labor and shifting some of the labor to us. And weirdly, like as consumers, we kind of don't mind that. But at the same time, that is part of a process of our firms considering ways how to replace minimum wage labor. It's debatable because one of the things we'll see later on in this chapter is that inelasticity can actually affect a lot of this. But for now, all that matters for your understanding is that a price floor creates a surplus. And in the case of minimum wage, a price floor creates possibly unemployment. Now, one more interesting tidbit I want to throw in here, just because I think it's information. Consider the fact that the minimum wage for Walmart is now something like $10 to $15, or like a quick raise to $15, $14, and that many other firms have gone up to $10. Basically, what that is a signal that maybe the current minimum wage in the United States is a non-binding price floor. Maybe we actually haven't changed in such a long time that the market has moved on and is reorienting it to higher prices and equilibrium. If that is the case, that again raises interesting questions of, are price controls useful or are they more damaging? But for now, how do we interpret price controls? Often, price controls can do more damage than they create good. Our example is we're kind of considering for higher minimum wage, does that lead to job substitution? Do we create more automated jobs? Um, do rent controls create increase homelessness? It attracts more people to move into these cities, but are they able to actually find affordable housing in these cities, or is housing impossible to find? For example, in New York City, like there's almost an illegal black market now, and that's the only way to find an apartment. Due to these challenges, economists often encourages subsidies as a workaround. And so what we've been talking about right now is these command and controls. And basically what that means is the state is going, this is how the market is going to work, and it shall not change from this. There may be cleverer ways to solve these problems. And just for example, almost all economists have a goal of increasing equality and increasing efficiency. Like this is kind of a core part of it. The earned income tax credit is one of those ways that they believe doesn't distort the market so much. And this is an amount of a cash boost on tax returns for individuals who worked but did not make a certain level of income. So basically, if you're below the threshold, but you also work nearly full time, what the earned income tax credit would say is we're going to actually bump up your pay and refund you in a tax credit. And so in reality, it makes you wealthier. Um, but it also doesn't distort the market by like altering substantially the prices the market needs to operate. So this leads us to another thing though of taxes, because this is the huge government policy that like affects every market. Um, by definition, a tax is just a levy instituted by government to generate revenue. If you're wondering what a levy is, this is kind of one of those tricky points where it's like a levy is a tax and a tax is a levy, but it doesn't make sense to call a tax a tax. Um, so what this means is it's basically mandatory fees the government creates to generate revenue. Um, and they can do multiple different kinds of taxes. For example, one kind of tax is a quantity tax, which is basically you tax an item. I'm trying to remember what the exact name of it is off the top of my head. I cannot. But you can tax things per item. You can tax things by percentages. So, for example, income tax, that's a percentage tax. We look at what is your income, and then we figure out a percentage tax on it. The tax incidence, this is the manner in which the burden of a tax is shared among participants in a market. This is determined by who's more inelastic. So before we reach the conclusion of this, just a reminder, in chapter 5, we talked about inelasticity and elasticity. And what we talked about, right, was that inelasticity means that your quantity demanded or quantity supplied won't change that much in regards to a price change. What that means is if the government institutes a tax, if the supplier or the buyer is less sensitive to price changes, the other group will shift the burden to them. So just imagine for a moment that you are a firm who has a very elastic consumer base. If you raised your prices, what would happen is you'd lose more revenue than otherwise if you had not instituted them. So instead, you'll just choose to bite the tax because you'll lose less revenue paying tax than you would if you shifted it to consumers. However, the classic example of this are cigarettes and sin taxes. And sin taxes are basically taxes instituted on items that the government views as like socially harmful. Cigarettes and alcohol receive these taxes aimed at discouraging this behavior. So basically, the idea is, well, if the quantity demanded goes down, the more expensive it gets. If we put a tax on it, then it should reduce quantity demanded. I think like tobacco is like 400%. So like the vast majority of the price of a pack of cigarettes is tax, not the consumer. However, cigarettes are addicting, right? So that means that for tobacco companies, they don't have to pay the tax. They just make their consumers pay for it because their consumers are going to pay for it. So this is the same for alcohol, and that's kind of the idea. Is it's just like because these two goods are particularly addictive goods, it makes the tax shift towards the consumer because the demand is relatively inelastic to the supply. So just to give you a few examples, let's imagine a tax on sellers, how this would look like. Um, So a tax on seller shifts the supply curve upward by the size of the tax, 50 cents. And so what ends up happening is that we have a reduction in the supply because our factors of production have gone up. So a tax is actually considered to affect the factors of production for suppliers. It's more expensive than things, so their supply shifts leftward. So in this case, we went from 100 units quantity supplied to 90 units quantity supplied in equilibrium, and our supply curve shifted leftward. Now at this intersection, this is the equilibrium with the tax. I want to notice something here. This is now the new price level, and notice that this new price level is roughly 30 cents higher than the original price level. Now, what this means is that ultimately the price that buyers pay is $3.30, and the price sellers receive is $2.80. And so this is trying to show us that because of this supply shift leftward, we're at a higher price equilibrium, and consumers now have to pay 30 cents more than they otherwise would have, and they actually bear, in this example, a higher version of the tax. The price sellers receive is $2.80. Again, if you're wondering, how do we know this is the price they receive? This is the 330 is the price at the equilibrium. So that's what buyers pay. And then we minus from that the prevailing equilibrium after the tax. In this case, the tax is 50 cents. So we minus 50 cents from $3.30, and that's how you wind up with $2.80. So just again, to clarify, how much do consumers pay after tax? They pay the new equilibrium price in this example, which is $3.30. How much do producers receive? Well, they have to cover the 50-cent tax, and so they pay 50 cents of the $3.30, and they wind up with $2.80. So as you can see here, the tax is just the difference between the price buyers pay and the price sellers receive. So what happens if we consider it a tax on buyers? Well, it's a similar situation. What ends up happening here is our demand shifts leftward, so our demand is decreasing and we move to the left. We still wind up at a lower equilibrium with the tax, right? So we've moved from this initial point to this point. And while our equilibrium price was $3, what we're now at is a price of $2.80. In this example, consumers only have to pay $2.80. However, most of the tax is paid by the consumer, and so therefore at $2.80, you add the 50 cents tax to get the buyer's payment of $3.30. All right, so let me clarify one more time. What's the difference here? Because like these are the same numbers. Let's look real quick. When the seller paid the tax, what happened was the buyers paid the equilibrium price, and then the seller paid the tax from the equilibrium price. So equilibrium was $3.30, and then sellers paid 50 cents tax. With the tax on the buyers, equilibrium is established at $2.80, and this is the price that sellers receive, but this is the actual price paid in the market. Like this is the price of the good. And then a 50-cent tax is added to the prevailing equilibrium price. So instead of like sellers paid the tax after the item was sold, buyers pay the tax when it's sold. All right, pause. Think about that for a little bit. And again, of course, don't hesitate. These you can always pause the video and read over these reviews as well. All this information is also in your textbook. And also, if you have any questions about this, don't hesitate to shoot me an email. But this is a little bit of a trickier concept for sure. So, final case, let's look at a payroll tax. A payroll tax places a wedge between the wage that workers receive and the wage that firms pay. And so if this is our labor supply, this upward curve, and this is our labor demand, we have this intersection. And basically what a tax wedge is it splits this tax between laborers and workers. And so say you, for example, contract at a salary of, let's just say a salary of $40,000 a year. If you're contracting at $40,000 a year, you're not really going to get the $40,000, right? What ends up happening is your firm has to pay taxes for the fact they employ you. And so your employer pays taxes above 40,000. And so this actually reduces the amount that they're willing to hire because they know that work is more expensive than just the $40,000 wage. While you aren't actually going to get your full wages because the government is also going to collect tax on the wage that employees receive. And so what ends up happening here is you end up having what we said was this little tax wedge in the sense that the real firm that wages are required to pay are higher and the real wage worker receives is lower. And so ultimately this means the labor supply is lower for this field and the labor demand for this field is also lower. And so first off, you can see, and I'm going to draw a little circle around, well, not a circle. First off, what you can see, let's see if I can outline this decently well. You can see we have this little red triangle. What is that little red triangle, you may be wondering? Deadweight loss. So the red triangle, that is deadweight loss. Why is this deadweight loss? Because this little red triangle, this no longer is in the market. These transactions no longer occur. The reason why is because we don't hire this many people. So we demand less people, and less people are willing to work for the job. So that means we actually have lost a few people. We'll talk about the deeper significance of this later, but for now, just notice that we're losing this. However, with this tax wedge, what we can do is calculate how much tax is actually paid. And so to understand how much tax is paid, let me kind of highlight here in green. This rectangle that I'm highlighting, or that I'm outlining now, this rectangle, this is our total tax revenue. And basically what this total tax revenue is this the amount of employees hired times the value of the tax, and that tells us how much tax revenue the government generates from this. For now, this is much more of just a precursor to something we're going to talk about later in a future chapter. But for now, I just want you to kind of be thinking about this, like, wow, they're paying more, they're paying less, so some jobs should be going away. Finally, taking elasticity into account, let me see if we can zoom in here. Great, there we go. Take elasticity into account. So as I mentioned, kind of as a precursor, we said that whoever's more inelastic is who pays the greater degree of the tax. And so just to give you an example, notice in this case that the demand is very inelastic. So the demand is steep. That's how we visually know that demand is inelastic, is that it's steeper than a 45-degree angle. Notice supply, though, is pretty flat. That means that it's elastic. So as the sample walks us through, what we see is when supply is more elastic than demand, the incidence of the tax falls more heavily on consumers than our producers. Now, again, we talked about cigarettes, right? If cigarettes are addictive, therefore that like if a price is instituted on tobacco companies just shift that to consumers, because even though the demand technically goes down a little bit, what's more likely is most of the people already buying it are willing to pay the higher price. And that's why this works, is because even though, yeah, we lose a few buyers, the reality is most of the consumers are willing to pay the higher price. And so the company isn't hurt that bad by the tax, and they share a smaller amount of the loss of the tax. So just to see, this was the price without tax. We instituted a big tax. The price sellers receive is only a little bit smaller than the price without tax. We can trace this. Here. So like that green line, that tells us the difference between the price without the tax and the price sellers now receive. But what's crazy is this red line I'm drawing. That's the difference between the price buyers pay and the price without the tax. And so as you can see, the red line is much bigger than the lime green line. So that's telling that consumers are who pay most of the tax in instance. In contrast, though, look at the inelastic supply and the elastic demand. And what you'll see here is, look at that. Supply is steep, demand is fairly flat. And in this case, the tax incidence falls more heavily on producers. So the price sellers receive is this bottom line. This was the price without tax. This is the price that buyers pay right above that. And so let me make that mark here. Notice that the price sellers receive, that big red line, ooh, not good, paying the tax. Buyers, meanwhile, are just paying this modest bit right here. So again, whoever is more inelastic, this is who winds up paying the tax. All right, that's going to be it for today, folks. Again, watch out. You'll have the study guide for this, so go take a reference to the study guide as you're watching the video. Fill out the study guide. Make sure you're reading the information. And excuse me. And as always, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out and let me know. All right, here, guys. See y'all next.